Welcome back to the Surviving Paradise podcast. As usual, a big thanks to everyone for all their notes throughout the week following the last episode. As you can tell, I'm having a lot of fun with this. I think it is it's really cathartic, and it's really something that so many of us have suffered at the hands of this crazy organization. So I want to take time to say welcome in to all my fellow mentally diseased apostates who are tuning in to the Surviving Paradise podcast, where we cover just how it is we survived this incredibly loving, this incredibly rich spiritual paradise of Jehovah's Witnesses, otherwise known as a cult. This week, we are going to tackle something that I have long had as a, God, does pet peeve even cover it? I don't even think that's strong enough when you're talking about this stuff. I've gone on record that a lot of what they do is funny, particularly after you've had time to heal. But the vast majority of it is really dangerous. It's deadly. And in this case, we're going to look at some of those examples of how this cult and the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses can prove to be deadly for someone, whether it a man, woman, or child. We're going to have some laughs because you have to laugh otherwise you're going to cry as you consider some of this stuff. But this week, I really want to tackle the subject of new light. And I know that I've even gotten some private messages and have many of my friends that have also left. I think this is one of our favorite subjects. Jehovah's Witnesses, as you know, claim to be the only group on the planet Earth to teach universal truth, that they alone have God magic or Holy Spirit, particularly the 8 guys in upstate New York, known as the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. So if this is the case, they truly are the most blessed group, and they continue to have a direct hotline to God himself and his son Jesus. One would really begin rather to question why it is that so much of this faith and this religion has changed and continues to change literally in the last 10 to 12 13, 14 years now that since I officially left the quote unquote organization, this religion is barely recognizable to me anymore. Some of the things that I handled as an elder, some of the things that I had to do to help others, some of the things I had to fix and the people I had to discipline, some of that doesn't even apply anymore. In as little as a decade, that's how fast and how quickly this religion changes, especially and certainly under the leadership of those 8 guys in upstate New York, known as the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. But this is one of the canned answers you will get from a Jehovah's Witness. For those that do study, for those that leave, for those that may simply have doubts, for those that may have questions about just a single Watchtower study or article, the answer they will get usually revolves around 2 things. Well, brother or sister, why don't you just wait on Jehovah for that? If you're listening and you are a Jehovah's Witness, I guarantee you've heard that. But the second one is, well, as the Bible teaches us and tells us, the light will only get brighter. That's right. Something that could completely flip-flop and change and dramatically impact the lives of millions of people, including life and death, can flip scripts within weeks, within months, within a very, very short time. And all of them under the umbrella of, well, brother or sister, the Bible tells us that the light just gets brighter. Where the hell does that come from? You may be wondering. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, maybe you were associated with as one of Jehovah's Witnesses for many, many years, and you don't even know where that comes from. But if you're someone just interested, let me tell you where that canned response comes from when you point out the dramatic changes in their teachings over the last century. That comes from the book of Proverbs, chapter 4 and verse 18, which reads, quote, But the path of the righteous one is like the bright light that is getting lighter and lighter until the day is firmly established. End quote. Nice comment, nice quote. What does it have to do with the ever changing doctrines, rules, disciplines, even health matters, and it literally encompasses everything Jehovah's Witnesses do? What does it have to do with that? Let me be the first to tell you, not much. Proverbs chapter 4 is in no way, shape, or form a chapter in the Bible that is referring to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society or the governing body and their doctrinal teachings as an ever changing strobe light in a person's life. It has nothing to do with that. Proverbs 4:18 and in fact the entire chapter, Proverbs chapter 4, is widely understood not only by scholars as just a commentary on the choice between good and bad in your life, but all you have to do is read it in context to see that it has absolutely nothing to do with ever changing doctrines, ever changing rules, disciplines, or anything else. It's absurd. It is absolutely ridiculous. And aside from the fact that you could read Proverbs chapter 4 and see that with the naked eye, we're going to unpack several examples of how incredibly stupid and moronic taking that verse, Proverbs chapter 4, out of context is, and trying to band aid it every time one of those guys in upstate New York decides they're going to dramatically change a foundation piece to the faith of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I mean to tell you, it happens all the time. So bear with me. This is one of those issues, those pet subjects that I don't even know if I can cover in one episode of Surviving Paradise, but it is incredibly important to understand how Jehovah's Witnesses think, not just from the leadership, but how it disseminates down to just every man, woman, and child as they literally check their brain at the door. They take it out of their head, put it in a mason jar, and just by rote say, well, the light just keeps getting brighter. Let's unpack that. First, let's just take an initial look to set the tone from the Bible itself. Again, needs its own episode, but Jehovah's Witnesses claim that they believe that the Bible is inspired of Jehovah and was especially written for their governing body and the faithful and discreet slave parable, all of whom reside in upstate New York in a nice looking resort setting now where they print out millions and millions of pages of books, although leaning more towards the internet now. I digress. What does the Bible say about the issue of light versus darkness? Okay. Let me give you an example. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. Quote, "For what fellowship do righteousness and lawlessness have? Or what sharing does light have with darkness? Further, what harmony is there between Christ and Belial?" End quote. 2 Corinthians 6, 14 and 15 from the New World Translation. Now, with that in mind, knowing where this coined phrase comes from in Proverbs, which has nothing to do with 8 guys in New York changing doctrines, it's simply a well-written chapter on choices between good and bad. Let's take a look at this in greater detail. Just as I read moments ago, light has no share with darkness. None. Zero. Not my words, not us evil apostate people out here pointing this out. Nope. That's from the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, as printed by the 8 guys in upstate New York. Their own Bible claims that light has no share with darkness. Now, the Oxford Advanced Learner's Dictionary defines darkness as the state of being dark without any light. So let's see how they've taken this phrase and tried to spin it away from anything anyone with common sense or a brain even remotely understands. When an organization consistently changes its doctrines, its beliefs, its laws over a 100 plus year period, as Jehovah's Witnesses have, is that truly the light getting brighter? Is it a strobe light, considering many of the doctrines were changed back to original teachings that were in print decades earlier? Light to dark to light to dark to light to light. Was it ever light at all? Let me give you some examples of this, because Jehovah's Witnesses' whole take on new light is staggering when you consider that right there in print, they've gone from light to dark to light, back to dark, and then back to light on some of these issues. They literally have reverted back to Charles Taze Russell, Joseph Rutherford, even prior in the early 1800s. After completely debunking it as new light, they go back to it as if light can return to being dark and then come back to light. Here's some examples for you. Consider some of the ever-changing light on some of these subjects. The superior authorities, as mentioned in Romans. It's gone from government to non-government, back to government, all in print. I'm not going to just reel off the references. Please go look it up. Here's one of my absolute favorite ones as the light has gotten brighter: organ transplants. Jehovah's Witnesses have literally gone out of their way, particularly in the late 60s and then again in the early 80s, to comment on organ transplants. Now, if you're sitting back there thinking to yourself, I've read the Bible, I'm fairly familiar with it, I'm pretty sure there's no mention of organ transplants in the Holy Scriptures. If you're thinking that, golly gee, you would be correct. There are no mentions of organ transplants either in the Old Testament or the New Testament. But in terms of light, imagine that. The 8 guys in upstate New York who have a direct line to Jesus claim that organ transplants are something that they can comment on, despite the fact that Jesus never did. Here's some of the doozies, the light to the dark to the light, when you consider organ transplants. They have said, Watchtower, 1967, November 15th, pages 702 to 704, they said, quote, sustaining one's life by means of the body or part of the body of another human would be cannibalism, a practice abhorrent to all civilized people. Watchtower of 1967, November 15th. I mean, it even got better, folks. It even got better, because just 8 years later, the light got brighter, so to speak, in the Watchtower of 1975, September 1st, page 519, where they took it a step further on organ transplants. Quote, a peculiar factor sometimes noted is a so-called personality transplant. That is, the recipient, in some cases, has seemed to adopt certain personality factors of the person from whom the organ came. 1975, they were making these kinds of comments. The light, according to them, was just getting brighter. Now, we laugh at that. We laugh at that whole concept, the coined phrase, and the ridiculousness that if someone got a kidney transplant, they took on the personality of the person they got it from. That's funny. Here's what's not funny. Imagine being the Jehovah's Witness parent of a child that needed a kidney transplant in, say, 1970, 71, 72. Although the Awake of 1949, December 22nd, had described transplants as wonders of modern surgery, there's your first light. In 1967, God suddenly revealed that transplants were bad in his eyes. I just read the quote, that it was likened to cannibalism. Now, if you're a parent, you're making a split decision there in the 1970s. Your child's everlasting life is on the line, according to this religion. You're looking at that going, my God, they can't have a kidney transplant. They can't have an eye transplant, a heart transplant, any of these things because Jehovah views this as evil according to the governing body and faithful, discreet slave. If this was a life and death matter, your child may have died. They may have died based on this new light in 1967. And if that isn't horrifying enough, imagine you're the same parent. Just 7, 8 years later, the Watchtower of 1980, March 15th, page 31, says this new light, quote, there is no biblical command pointedly forbidding the taking in of another human tissue. It's a matter for personal decision, end quote. There isn't any amount of trying to explain new light, misquoting a ridiculous comment from Proverbs chapter 4 on good and bad and trying to make it fit your narrative. A child has died based on your new light. And then 7 years later, you get more new light from Jehovah. We're all supposed to believe, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, that this is coming from Jehovah and his son, that they're just changing their mind while people die, including children. The Enlightenment or light of 1967 was deadly. They turned around 13 years later in 1980 and said, oops, our bad. Sorry about that. Here's some more new light. It's okay to get an organ transplant. We can laugh at the stupidity of stuff said in 75 about personalities invading organs. We can't laugh at the fact that this doctrine or this thought or this phrase that they've completely lifted from Proverbs chapter 4 and has nothing to do with what they say has cost people their lives. It's deadly. It's deadly. Period. But they'll pass it off as new light. Easy to say here in 2022, not as easy for a parent or a loved one or anybody who's lost someone who could have survived and lived a long, healthy life that just needed an organ transplant. But oops, we were in between strobe light flashes from Jehovah. That's what we're expected to believe in this matter of new light. Remember, we've already read from their Bible that light and darkness cannot have any share with one another. They're complete polar opposites. They can't exist. Okay? Let's look at another example of new light in action. Here's one that I'll try to be delicate for anyone that might be listening. It's highly personal, but I think it's pretty common. The issue of oral sex. That's right. If you're thinking to yourself right now in this moment, I'm trying to remember where Jesus talked about oral sex in the Bible. Please don't get a headache. He didn't. He didn't. Nor is it mentioned anywhere else, including the Old Testament. Okay. But Jehovah's Witnesses throughout several decades have had light, back to darkness, then back to light, then back to the old way of saying, which must be darkness, right? Then back to light on matters that had nothing to do with anything taught in the Bible. And this is a perfect one, oral sex, something that's highly personal that should be between two married people or not married people, two partners that have just agreed to be devoted to one another, or frankly, let's be honest, just want to have a good time. It has nothing to do with anything taught in the Bible. They brought in new light, then reverted back to old light, then went back to new light. They taught at one point in matters of oral sex, and I'll have a whole episode on the bizarre obsession with sexuality of Jehovah's Witnesses. But they taught at one point that you would be disfellowshipped if you were caught doing this with your mate. Yeah. The last time they've commented on oral sex, the last new light from Jehovah was in 1983, where they once again said that someone could be disfellowshipped if this got out into the congregation that two people were having oral sex, including man and woman married people, that a brother could be removed as an elder. It's in print. May 1983. Since then, they've just backed away from all of it. I'll continue on with examples of light and how it's ever changing. By far and away now, the most bizarre and unexplainable light that Jehovah's Witnesses have ever invented, and they've had to, because it's the core of their entire ridiculous religion, is the teaching on generations. If you're just tuning in and you're curious what the Jehovah's Witness belief is in that, I will try not to bog down this podcast with the whole generations teaching. But essentially, for decades, for nearly the better part of a century, going back and forth, won't go too far in details, they taught that we were living in the last days and that the generation that was born or could understand a whole nother's podcast episode, the year 1914, as the time Jesus took the throne, that generation would not die before the end came. So, if you're sitting back now and you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, don't remember that 1914 thing in the Bible, you'd be correct. But even better, let's say it's true. Let's just pretend it's true. If no one in 1914 was supposed to die before Armageddon came and the fireballs killed everyone, doesn't that make them well over 100 and wait a minute? You would be correct. In fact, the classic one is seen right here on this podcast tile, where the Awake magazine said this generation will not pass away, with a whole litany of anointed ones on the cover of the magazine that are in fact dead. And Armageddon has not come yet. So this facilitated, you guessed it, new light. I really should do that with a deep voice. New light. They had to change the entire teaching on this generation not passing away to now come up with, and I'm not going to begin to explain the most, in fact, this is how you just stump a Jehovah's Witness, any of them. And I mean elders, any of them. Ask them to teach you the generations teaching. It's the most convoluted, ridiculous thing you've ever heard. But in a nutshell, they suddenly went in the late 90s. They were hinting at it then in the 2000s that this generation now might pass away after all, but now it's just people who knew them who might have known somebody who knew them. And now the generations teaching can go on into infinity, because every few years they can claim they got new light that says it's not the generation of 1914, it's just someone who knew someone that knew someone that knew someone in 1914. On and on it goes. The most bizarre teaching that is going to be the longest episode in the history of this podcast to even unpack how ridiculous it is. But it is again claimed to be new light, lifted from Proverbs 4:18. Those guys in upstate New York got a vision or a phone call or something from Jehovah himself, and suddenly now the foundation of the entire religion has changed. And it is really this generation's teaching that probably caused the greater number of people in recent times to bail, exit stage left, because it's so preposterous and so stupid that even they can't explain it. Even they can't explain it. Another issue on this whole idea of new light surrounded college and higher education. I was an 80s kid. If you were a kid in the 80s and 90s, and even today, but it was very strong back then, you did not even consider college. You didn't even give it a second thought. You would be seen as bad association, or in the very least spiritually weak. Then, of course, they loosened that with new light. Because, at Brooklyn Bethel, going back many decades, people started to question, well, aren't there doctors and lawyers and engineers? Where did they had to go to college? Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner. Common sense wins again. So that entire teaching on college and higher education waffles back and forth. And I put it in that Jehovah's Witness urban myth category. Can't wait to have an episode on that, where, oh, no, we don't really say that. Trust me, it's in millions of pages of print, the negative connotation with higher education and college. One of my personal favorite new lights in recent times is the blood doctrine, a doctrine that is not only absurd and taught nowhere in the Bible, but it is a doctrine that has killed thousands of people, including children. Again, much like the organ transplants, They've waffled back and forth. Most of us had the old blood cards in our wallets. If you haven't seen those, folks, with the medical directive, ask an old timer to see one. I don't know if perhaps they still carry them. I don't know, to be quite honest with you. But for a time, anything having to do with blood was condemned. If you are to take a blood transfusion right now as a Jehovah's Witness and the elders find out, you can be disfellowshipped and shunned from your family and everyone you love for saving your own life or the life of your child or a family member. But this issue of blood is so controversial that I personally believe they will never change it. I have other people who come forward and constantly ask me, they got to change that. I don't believe it. I think it will be so far down the road outside my lifetime. There is so much litigation buried in this doctrine, so much pain, so much tragedy that it defies any human conscience that this continues. I personally believe that they know they've screwed up with the blood doctrine. I know that they can't change it because there will be people who come forward whose family are dead now because they didn't take blood. But it is by far one of the most disturbing new light teachings that has waffled back and forth. For years, you couldn't go anywhere near blood. Then they started allowing fractions. That's right, just fractions found in blood, as if that doesn't make up blood. For example, you can have a piece of cheese. You're allowed to have some lettuce. You're allowed a piece of bread. Feel free to have a spoonful of mustard. You can even have a piece of ham and a piece of turkey. What you cannot have is a ham and turkey sandwich. And if you think I'm kidding, that sums up the blood doctrine now. You can have fractions found in blood, but you can't have blood. It is one of the most absurd teachings among Jehovah's Witnesses. It's deadly, it's dangerous, and it may be the single greatest factor that should cause authorities, governments, and others to ban this cult, as it's absolutely deadly. You can tell I'm getting fired up here. A couple of other examples, of course, are neutrality in wartime periods, which is a little different now, particularly in the Americas, not as much in other countries, but neutrality was an issue that they waffled back and forth on. You could actually not go to war, but you're okay to work in the bomb factory, making bombs that are used at war. Then they flipped out of that because they got new light from Jehovah. I think you're getting the theme here. They claim all of this new light comes from God, but we're going to unpack that. And then, of course, one of my favorites that I will continually poke fun at, and when I have guests on, are going to continually poke fun at, is this whole idea of the faithful and discreet slave, the anointed, chosen by Jesus, members of the 144,000, suddenly a literal number in Revelation. The dragons aren't, though. That now make up just the governing body. This teaching alone is so culty and so mind-blowing that anyone with common sense would believe. It just staggers the imagination. At one point, it was a body of people going to heaven, including women. Now, women are eliminated from the faithful and discreet slave, as are 99.9% of the people who claim they're going to heaven. It's now just 8 guys in upstate New York. And this came about in recent times. That doctrine has gone from light to dark to light to new light to back to dark to new light. It's absolute insanity. So those are a few examples off the top of my head in reference to new light. But I ask you this. If we take all the doctrinal stuff out and we take out digging deep on each of these teachings and quoting a bunch of Watchtower articles and doing all of this, I ask you this. Was any of this ever light? Bright light. Was it ever light from God or his Son when it was clearly wrong? Does light spring from complete darkness, then go back to being light, and then go dark, and then get light again? I ask you this. Can light get brighter when it was never light to begin with? Just flat out wrong. They had the cure to cancer. They they encouraged people to kill themselves rather than have tonsillectomies. They taught Charles Taze Russell sold the magical wheat in the pages of the Watchtower. All of this to a Jehovah's Witness would say, well, why are you reading that, you evil apostate? That's old light. People, if it was wrong, how was it ever light to begin with? Could it be that all of these contradictory teachings available in millions of pages of print are just the result of changing men, changing leadership, different personalities, different men from different walks of life that are part of the governing body, that have assumed roles within the organization, personal opinions that they have just infected millions of people with? We've already read from the Bible itself, their book, not mine, that light and dark have no share with each other. And I'm going to read more scriptures to this effect. The Bible's very open about the difference between light and dark. It's very, very open about it. But humor me this, because for me personally, this issue of new light stabs more at the humanity and the nuance of religion or spirituality. So answer me this. If you're a Jehovah's Witness bravely listening, or you're someone that's on the fence about it, if all of their teachings are truly light, ever changing, but light, what is this organization doing to go back and find every single person in the world that they taught old light to, in other words, darkness, over the past 100 years? Don't they have the responsibility to right the wrong, the old light, and update each and every person who made life altering decisions based on their light at the time? Another question: how does new light work? Is there some sort of flash from the heavens? Is there some kind of cell phone call? Do they still see burning bushes or talking donkeys or serpents? Or go up, climb a mountain and get ancient tablets and come down with glowing faces? How does this new light work? Logistically, take the emotion out of it. How did you go from that light, which apparently wasn't light because it was wrong, to get new light? Was the Bible itself an incomplete work so that God himself needed some old guys in Wallkill, now Wallkill, New York, to complete his communication with man? Because the Bible says something different. It says it's completely perfect, inspired for all good things. We'll get to have a little episode on that. Teaching a man to be completely competent, fully equipped. Well, I guess the Bible was kind of lying, or at least, maybe that's some new light coming. You could literally drive yourself insane if you're a thinking person with this canned reply from Jehovah's Witnesses. The light is getting brighter. As you look into each of the subjects, and I just reeled off a few of them and many more, you will find that it was never light at all. It wasn't even truth. It wasn't even correct. So it couldn't have been light. So you can't get new light because it was never light. It was just wrong. It's nothing more than erroneous human opinions, typically 7 or 8 guys throughout the decades up there in New York, just spewing their own personal opinions over and over and over. Now, we said at the outset of this that light has no share with darkness. And I mentioned that the Bible's very open about that. So again, we'll take their instruction manual and we already know that they lifted it from Proverbs 4, which had nothing to do with a publishing company in New York and their ever-changing doctrines. They simply lifted some words out of a spurious verse out of context. So what does the Bible say about light and darkness and about God himself? I read you the first one in 1 Corinthians. Consider 1 John 1:5. Quote, "And this is the message which we have heard from him and are announcing to you, that God is light and there is no darkness at all in union with him. End quote. God is light. He's never wrong. He's a bright light in a dark room, and he is most certainly never darkness. So if you're someone who's stumbling into this spiritual paradise now, and you continue to believe in God, we certainly respect that. It's very easy to see that he, according to the Bible, doesn't have any share with anything that isn't light. Therefore, if it was wrong, people, it was never from God. At no point would God revert to darkness and then back to light, as if to test people. Take a look at James 1:13. God doesn't test people. I'm very certain after reading the Bible multiple times front to back that God doesn't work like a disco strobe light with a Bee Gees soundtrack, trying to go back and forth, light and dark, based on the decade, the year, the concept, who the governing body is. That's not God. I stated that I would stay away from all of the doctrinal things for the most part, but you have to take a look at them when you consider that Jehovah's Witnesses change doctrines that alter people's lives, that get people killed. There's nothing funny about it. There's literally nothing funny about it, whether it's neutrality, whether it's blood, whether it's generations teaching and you never married, never had children, and it's too late, whether you have no retirement fund because you thought the end was coming in the 80s because that generation was almost dead, whether you needed an organ transplant, you didn't get it. These aren't funny things. We can laugh at the stupidity of this, but what we're laughing at is it almost seems like a comic strip that anyone would accept, any thinking adult would rationally accept this kind of an answer from a Jehovah's Witness. And I guarantee you, approach 20 of them, 19 of them are going to say the light just gets brighter because that's all they've heard at a Kingdom Hall. But again, what does their Bible say? Okay, we've reeled off a few areas and they're subjects for their own episodes of doctrinal teachings that they have dramatically changed. But consider what the Bible says about someone who says, here's a fact, and then that fact is completely wrong, so they just say, the light just gets brighter. Again, I think we all know from an illustration standpoint, light can't turn back to dark, then from absolute darkness spring light going back and forth. It doesn't work that way. What does the Bible say about someone who makes a claim? Let's just take generations. This generation will not pass away before the end occurs. All of these people, these anointed people of Jehovah's Witnesses that saw 1914 will never die before Armageddon hits. Unfortunately, folks, they're all dead. I think you can do the math between 1914 and 2022. I think you can do it. They're gone. So what does the Bible say about someone who makes a claim, anyone, including, I will say it, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, and then it doesn't come true? As a kid, I used to see this on picket signs, never put two thoughts to it until I was older. But the scripture of Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22 out of the New World Translation says it succinctly. It says, and I quote, "However, the prophet who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die. And in case you should say in your heart, how shall we know the word that Jehovah has not spoken? When the prophet speaks in the name of Jehovah, and the word does not occur or come true, that is the word that Jehovah did not speak. With presumptuousness, the prophet spoke it. And as stated, that prophet must die." Friends, the history of... Oh, I just said friends again. Somebody kick me. Send me a DM and laugh at me on that. That's such a coined convention phrase. Can't believe it. Old habits. The entire history of Jehovah's Witnesses is ever-changing doctrines. Doctrines today that were stated or brought to an elder back in the early 1900s or even the 40s and 50s, where they would be considered apostate, today are accepted as truth. Their entire library is filled, it is brimming with what I just described at Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22. A prophet who said something in God's name and it didn't come true. The Bible says it itself. That person isn't from Jehovah. They're not associated with him. So we don't even need to consider how New Light works, because, newsflash, Jehovah ain't talking to these guys. He's not giving them new light. Light doesn't just bounce around. Those teachings didn't come from God. They came from men. So putting your very life, your thoughts, and your feelings into the hands of men, what does the Bible say about that? This is one of their most quoted scriptures, and it's what I use with every Jehovah's Witness I run into. I don't try to get into doctrine because I know they don't study. I don't try to get into the Bible because I know most of them have never read it. I just ask them this because it's one of the most quoted verses. They use it in every service meeting. They use it countless times in talks. It's highly quoted verse, and that's where the irony lays. But again, what does the Bible say about handing your life over, your thoughts and your feelings to men? It's simple. Psalms 146:3, New World Translation, quote, "Do not put your trust in nobles, nor in the son of earthling man, to whom no salvation belongs." No earthling man. Do not trust them. No salvation. When I encounter a Jehovah's Witness now, and before they even get to New Light, because I won't go there, I know none of them have studied. They won't even know what I'm talking about. I simply ask them, do you believe the Bible is inspired of God? And they, of course, say, well, absolutely. Depending on the person, I'll ask them, have you read it? Which leads to a real interesting conversation. But the other thing I'll ask them then, well, are you familiar with Psalms 146:3? And they'll say, and I'll say, it says, do not put your trust in nobles, and then they'll finish it, nor in the son of earthly man, to whom no salvation belongs. Correct. Yeah, of course. Inspired of God. You could agree. Oh, absolutely. Why do you follow the governing body? You're commanded from your own book to not trust them, to not put your trust in them. They can't bring you salvation, despite the fact that I could read 30 minutes worth of quotes where they claim in their own Watchtower magazine that there's no salvation outside of being part of them and obeying them word for word. Cult. There's no denying it. The only thing denying it at that point is cognitive dissonance. You're directly in conflict with what you said, your letter from your God says to not do. It's uncanny. So this issue of new light with every changing doctrine, you could see why it's one of my pet peeves. You could see why it's something that should be examined, and it's so easy to debunk. Because the Bible's so open about light. It has no share with darkness. I've read several scriptures about it. So if you said something wrong, organ transplant, blood, neutrality, generations, and it's proven to be wrong, it was never light, much less new. It can't be new light when it was never light at all. It was just a lie by men. But if you really want to get ironic, consider what the governing body even says on this matter of making bold claims, claiming they're from God, that they're new light, and what should be done to this type of person. The pages of the Watchtower, May 15th, 1976, page 298. Quote, "It is a serious matter to represent God in Christ in one way, then find that our understanding of the major teachings and fundamental doctrines of the scriptures was an error. And then after that, to go back to the very doctrines that by years of study we had thoroughly determined to be in error. Christians cannot be vacillating, wishy-washy about such fundamental teachings. What confidence can one put in the sincerity or judgment of such persons?" End quote. The density by which these leaders speak to people and about people and in condemnation of themselves is staggering. It's staggering. They condemn themselves. They describe themselves constantly in a negative light and are too dense to recognize it. The very foundation, just taking that quote from the May 15th, 1976 Watchtower, the very foundation of Jehovah's Witnesses, the cornerstone, the very doctrine that they claim identifies them as God's organization, that being the Generations teaching of 1914, that doctrine has changed 6 times. 6 times. Let me read that quote again in their own Watchtower, May 15th, 1976. It's a serious matter to represent God and Christ in one way, then find that our understanding of the major teachings, Generations, and fundamental doctrines, Generations, of the Scripture was an error. And then after that, to go back to the very doctrines that by years of study we had thoroughly determined to be in error. Christians cannot be vacillating, wishy-washy about such fundamental teachings. People, the very foundation teaching of Jehovah's Witness that they were chosen in 1919 after Christ took the throne in 1914, and they alone are God's true organization, that the governing body have a direct satellite feed to God's brain in Jesus, has changed 6 times. 6 times in the last less than a century. Charles Taze Russell said it himself in the Watchtower, February 1881, page 188. He said, "A new view of truth never can contradict a former truth. New light never extinguishes older light. The true increase is by adding to, not by substituting one for another." Oops. It's clear that the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society have not followed their own line of reasoning. The never-ending changes to what they consider truth are well documented in millions of pages of their literature. And as we've stated on this podcast in the past, they're trying to hide it. They're trying to dump it. They're taking it off Kingdom Hall shelves. You can get the old light on eBay now. You can get it on Amazon. For over 100 years, Jehovah's Witnesses have been teaching doctrines that have literally resulted in people dying. Whether it's political neutrality or the blood doctrine, innocent people have made decisions on what they were taught at that time by God's self-proclaimed representatives here on the earth. You have to take the time to look deeper at what it is that you say you believe in and who you say you believe in. I encourage anyone listening to look much deeper into the blood doctrine and how it was formed, to look into the situation in Malawi in Africa. For those of us that were kids or grew up during that time period, 70s, writing letters to the Malawi government, while at the same time the Mexican brothers were allowed to do what the Malawi brothers weren't. Malawi men and women were murdered and killed. Take a look into that situation. Take a look into the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society's involvement and membership in the United Nations. This former elder spent countless hours, wasted hours, studying the Watchtower and teaching almost every Sunday, at least 2 out of 4 Sundays a month, about the United Nations, false religion, the scarlet-colored wild beast, and then only to find out that the Watchtower Bible Tract Society was a member. Couldn't be class president as a 6th grader, but you could be a member of the United Nations. You're going to laugh, you're going to cry, you're going to throw things. Anybody reasonable would experience a range of difficult emotions. It's incredible that millions of people can allow themselves to follow 8 guys. They can accept anything they hear on a stage, at a convention, or in their meetings weekly at the Kingdom Hall. They just accept it. It could be new light, could be old light. It's no light at all. I guarantee it. It's incredible. Another scripture, just as we close out, Galatians 1, 6 through 9, New World Translation. It says, quote, however, even if we, this is the Apostle Paul speaking, again, the Bible's inspired. Ask that question first. When they say yes, here's what you ask or read. Quote, however, even if we or an angel out of heaven were to declare to you as good news something beyond what we declared to you as good news, let him be accursed. As we have said above, I also now say again, whoever it is that is declaring to you as good news something beyond what you accepted, let him be accursed. The theme's pretty clear. It doesn't have anything to do with being an apostate. It doesn't have anything to do with, I just hate Jehovah's Witnesses. It has nothing to do with that. It's just not true. It's a lie. It's an absolute lie. Another thing that they'll throw out there, in fact, at one point it was quoted in the Reasoning from the Scriptures book, now dated publication, page 136. They try to reason, well, I'm glad you brought up the apostles, because the apostles weren't perfect guys. They had some wrong expectations at a time or two. They did. But again, you're looking at a straw man argument. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. The apostles didn't teach major doctrinal changes, major doctrinal foundation stones to a religion, and claim strict obedience to them personally, like the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses does, only to find out that they completely change it again a few years later. It's not even the same thing. How many of the apostles' writings in the Bible are wrong? 0. How many, or what's the percentage of Watchtower statements that are wrong? Zillions. Hundreds. They've made absolute error after error that have cost people their lives. That's the most serious part. And on the back end, it's just comical. Who in their right mind thinks they can comment on two grown adults and their sexuality, or how they comb their hair, or what clothes they wear? None of this is covered in the Bible. But Jehovah's Witnesses, under the leadership of the governing body, would tell you, well, if something new comes down, it's just new light. It's not new light. It's human opinions. It's not new light at all. So this issue of new light has always been one that's driven me nuts. And I will probably walk away from this episode and have 20 other thoughts on this. But I can tell you that new light isn't a strobe light. As an illustration, in Proverbs chapter 4, light doesn't just spring from darkness, and darkness just doesn't spring from light and then go back to dark and then back to light, back and forth, like Jehovah's Witness teachings have. And they have. One minute you get an organ transplant, then you can't. One minute you're allowed to have oral sex in your marriage, the next you'll be disfellowshipped for it. Oops, our fault, new light, now you can do it again. Newsflash, it was never any of your damn business. Why are you commenting on it? So on this issue of new light, I would really love to hear some of the great stories that you've encountered as you bring to an elder's attention or a circuit overseer's attention, yeah, about this new light thing. This generations thing seems like a big deal, huh? I mean, if you're a third generation witness, your parents or grandparents died believing that they were going to heaven or resurrected to a paradise earth. That's all been thrown into a pot of crap now, as the generation teaching doesn't mean the generation of 1914. You just had to know somebody who knew somebody who might have known somebody alive in 1914. Can you see what they've done there? Their core doctrine that Christ took the throne in 1914 and chose them in 1919 suddenly now has no expiration date. They can use that line of reasoning. They've masterfully thrown this under the noses of millions of modern day Jehovah's Witnesses, and they've masterfully, coerced them into believing this ad infinitum. The next generation 50 years from now will say, well, it's the generation's teaching. I knew somebody who knew somebody in 2022 who knew somebody in 1956 who knew a grandmother in 1917. They can literally take their core teaching that gives them all their authority and move it throughout eternity now. So no, I'm not someone that's ever believed Jehovah's Witnesses will disappear, because there's too many people who are desperately looking for someone to tell them what to do and what to believe. There'll always be a figment of them, a segment, a small crowd. Do I think that they're going to have to do something again with several other teachings? Of course, new light will suddenly spring from nowhere. Like, if you want to look at other new lights, take a look at the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, whether they were going to be resurrected or not. Then they were, then they weren't. Take a look at things like people resurrected on their paradise earth, if they'll get to marry their former spouse in paradise, whether they will or won't. There's so many of these quote unquote new light teachings. And if you question them, or you use your brain to ask an educated question, you'll get one of two answers. Well, why don't you wait on Jehovah? Or, well, that's just new light. The light's getting brighter and brighter. Actually, it's not getting brighter because the old light we believed 10 minutes ago wasn't light. It was just wrong. So it can't get new. You've just changed it. And so I ask you in conclusion, does truth change? Does truth change? Do we picture Jesus and Jehovah getting together, once every few years, a week, every month? I got an idea. Let's give those guys down there some new light, a new understanding. Well, yeah, Father, says Jesus, but lots of people have suffered. Some have even died because they made decisions on that light you gave them last week. Yeah, that doesn't matter. We're going to give them some new stuff now. It makes it all better. It begs the question at the core, what kind of God is this? Why is he allowing us to believe in something that isn't true for years, decades, centuries? Things that have cost people their lives. You don't even have to get technical with these questions with Jehovah's Witnesses. Just keep it basic. Most of them don't study. I've said that blatantly, and I'll continue to say it because I know it's true. People I love that are still Jehovah's Witnesses don't study, never have. They don't know any of these basic teachings. They couldn't teach it to anybody. Keep it basic. New light. Lifted from a verse in Proverbs chapter 4 about good choices and bad choices, somehow has turned into, it's about 8 guys in upstate New York that get a special God magic communication from Jehovah and Jesus, who've allowed people to believe complete falsehood for a long period of time. And now today they've decided to clear it up. New light. Cha-ching. I'm going to stop there. I could go on for much, much longer, but I will say this. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're thinking about approaching an elder or a circuit overseer or somebody, asking them about a doctrinal change, and you get the new light thing, just know that if you push the issue, they're going to mark you. They're going to consider you as spiritually weak. They may even begin to question your belief in the organization. They'll never ask if you believe in Jehovah or Jesus. What they'll do is pull you in the B school and ask, do you believe the governing body is God's spokesman here on the earth? Cult. That's all it is, tragically. I thank everybody for listening and for the support as we continue to do this. I keep promising guests. I'm lining some up, I promise. We're going to have a really good time walking through some nostalgia, particularly for Jehovah's Witness kids of the 60s, 70s, 80s, because, gosh, that's where I'm from. So there's going to be all sorts of talk about some of the fun stuff that we endured and went through, and even our own personal experiences and vulnerabilities. So stay tuned. I really appreciate the support. I'd love to hear what you think about New Light. I hope that you don't see this podcast episode as me giving you new light, because I am not. I think it's one of those fascinating subjects that deserves probably much more than an hour. So thanks again for the support. Please tell me in the comments, whether it's on Twitter at Surviving Paradise Podcast or liking and subscribing on YouTube. We're also on Spotify, Apple iTunes, Google Podcasts, all that good stuff. I'd love to hear from folks. I've really gotten to meet some new people and see some new comments and reconnect with some great friends from my past as a Jehovah's Witness. Would love to hear what you think. So, for all my fellow mentally diseased apostates who actually use their brain and have gotten free of the cognitive dissonance of Jehovah's Witnesses, I say be well. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of the Surviving Paradise podcast.